So good evening, everyone. We'd like to start our meeting off this evening acknowledging the traditional and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples who are the stewards of these lands. We acknowledge the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabeg. We especially acknowledge the Chippewa of Beausoleil First Nation and Rama First Nation. We also recognize the Métis nationhood that also exists in the area of Tiny, Tay, Penetanguishene, and parts of Baxter and Byng Inlet, currently represented in our community by the Georgian Bay Métis Council. We recognize and deeply respect their ongoing relations to these lands. These connections need to be clearly and overtly related to our collective agreement as a nation to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm Faith, I'm your community engagement librarian. If you have any ideas or questions about library programs, services, or outreach, feel free to be in touch. Please make sure your microphone is muted until the question and answer period so we all have the best experience we can. And camera on or off, the recorded view will just be of Amanda, so that's your preference. I'm so pleased to introduce Amanda Leduc tonight. Amanda's a disabled writer and author of the nonfiction book Disfigured on fairy tales, disability, and making space. It was published by Coach House Books in 2020 and shortlisted for the 2020 Governor General's Award in Nonfiction and longlisted for the 2020 Barbara Lyon Prize. She is also the author of the novel The Miracles of Ordinary Men, published in 2013 by ECW. And her new novel that we're here to talk about, The Centaur's Wife, is out now with Random House Canada. Her essays and stories have appeared across Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia. She speaks regularly across North America on accessibility and the role of disability in storytelling. Born in British Columbia, she's lived in Ontario, England, BC, and Scotland, and holds a master's degree in creative writing from the University of St. Andrews. Amanda has cerebral palsy and presently makes her home in Hamilton, Ontario, where she lives with a very lovable, very destructive dog that we might get a chance to see tonight. And she serves as the Communications and Development Coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, the Fold Festival. It's Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. Welcome, Amanda. How are you?
I'm great, Faith. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with everyone tonight. And I'm so pleased that you could make the time. I'm looking forward to discussing the book with all of you.
Is there a place you'd like to start with the book, a passage you'd like to start off reading, or shall we dive right in?
Let's dive right in.
All right. Let's see some of the things that we wanted to talk about. The book shows us a lot of different ways of coming into family or coming into a community. And some of these are by choice or certainly into the community by necessity, or some of both in the terms of Heather and Brendan's marriage, and then all the way to Tasha and Annie coming into and becoming leaders in the community. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I guess when I was writing the book, initially I was thinking about that's what it means really to deal with grief. And I was thinking when I initially started writing the book, I was also thinking about desire and what it meant to desire something that you can't have. And that ended up dovetailing quite nicely into the idea of grief, because when you grieve something, it's grieving and desiring something that you'll never get back. And I was interested in how communities come together and the way that people find one another in the wake of loss or the wake of trauma, and how people are essentially making a journey toward something that they can experience together, something that they can use to build their world anew again. And when I was going through first drafts of the book, at the time, I was really interested in writing a dystopia because a lot of dystopias were quite popular. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel had just recently come out. And I liked that idea of getting rid of the world around you, like the world that we know, just sort of obliterating, and what happens when you have to start fresh. So that question was kind of central to the genesis of the book. And then as subsequent drafts came together, it became, still a novel about desire, very much a novel about grief, and then also a novel about disability and the ways that desire and grief play out in disability, in both one's personal experience of it, and then also in, knowing and interacting with people who have disabilities themselves. And how do you, move forward into a world that looks quite different? How do you build community when all the community that you have known in the past is gone? So that was something that really interested me about that kind of central question in the book, and the ways that the various communities and partnerships and sort of familial bonds came together in the book sort of happened really organically once I had kind of figured out those initial questions. Mm-hmm.
You're clearly drawn to fairy tales and fables. Neither my coworker or I had a chance to read your first book in advance, but what is it about the fairy tale or fable stories that appeal to you? Is it about bringing them into greater public consciousness in a more unvarnished way than the way we maybe heard them growing up, or what's the motivation around that?
Well, I've always liked fairy tales. I've always been, it's cliche, but I watched a lot of Disney movies when I was a kid. I sort of, grew up around the time of The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and The Lion King. So that's sort of what feels to me like the golden age of Disney movies. Obviously, that's a generational viewpoint of my own. I'm sure people would say that the golden age is now with things like Moana and films like that. But I was very romantic, still am in many ways. And I liked the idea of stories that have these kinds of happy endings, right? There's a very, very clear order in many ways to many of the Disney-fied versions of fairy tales that we know, where, you have a character who sort of sets out on some kind of quest and they encounter difficulties and challenges, but they sort of stick to their guns and go through and they eventually get their happy ending. And I really liked the rhythm of those stories when I was younger. And then I got a little bit older and I started looking at some of the original versions of fairy tales, so not the Disney versions of things. And a lot of them are really quite dark and quite morbid in some ways, quite terrifying in others. And I was initially, interested in the differences there. Why were the fairy tales that we, had told for generations and centuries so dark? And why were the stories told by Disney so different? But then I really started to find myself, as I grew older, drawn to the darker versions of the tales. I think because I was also, slowly coming into recognition of my own awareness of my life as a disabled person and how that had been difficult in many ways. And the sort of bright and happy Disney-fied versions of the tales didn't really ring true to me anymore. And the darker versions of the tales, where sometimes things don't work out for characters, actually started to make more sense. And when I was writing The Centaur's Wife, in many ways, The Centaur's Wife is a novel about storytelling and the way that we tell stories to one another as a method of coping with and getting through trauma. The various characters in the novel tell fairy tales to themselves and to one another as a way of kind of making sense of the world around them, which has really, at the beginning of the novel, there is this kind of environmental disaster that has happened, and all the touch points that we know that make our world what it is have vanished. So they're really trying to make sense of catastrophe, and the way that they do that is by telling stories that maybe on the face of it don't necessarily make sense themselves. There's a wonderful writer, a wonderful poet by the name of Therese Estechon. She's a Filipino-Canadian poet, and she had a book that came out earlier this year called Phantom Pains. It's wonderful. I highly recommend checking it out. And she talks a lot about fairy tales and folk tales in the Filipino tradition, and how the sort of myth and magic in those tales was very instrumental for her. She's also a disabled woman. She encountered a bacterial virus a couple of years ago, which necessitated some amputations. And when she was writing about this experience and writing about what it meant to inhabit a different body, she found herself drawn to fairy tales and folk tales because of the way that they talk about magical things, but in so doing, they also talk about the ways that our world is different and hard to understand. And I think, fairy tales for me really do that. They're kind of, not necessarily something you can easily pin down. And I find comfort in that because there's a lot about the world, even as it is, this sort of ordered, quote unquote, ordered world that we live in right now. That still doesn't make sense to me. And that, I still find difficult to deal with. And so telling myself these stories and finding comfort and finding solace in these stories has been something that has been a huge part of my reading life and for a long time, and now my writing life as well. I have a couple other projects on the go right now, and many of them have that kind of fairy tale lens, looking at it in different ways. But I think it's definitely a theme that will carry forward into my work for some time, maybe not forever, but at least for the next little while, for sure.
Well, a few of us were having discussions about the book. A couple of us said that we weren't even sure at the beginning whether it was whether the story of the centaur and his wife was a traditional fable from someplace or whether it was one of your inventions. How did you come up with that device and with the different ways of writing in the two sort of elements of the book?
Well, I think the dystopic sort of real world element of the novel came first. I wanted it initially to be a dystopia. So I was thinking about it solely in terms of being an apocalyptic story that had slightly magical elements because I knew that there was a centaur involved. And then as subsequent drafts of the novel came to be, and it became much more, like I was saying, a book about trauma and about reliving trauma, the characters started telling stories to themselves. And I wrote The Centaur's Wife sort of from 2014 is when the initial short story that inspired the novel came out. And then I started working on the novel in earnest in 2016 at the beginning of the year. And I wrote it right up until kind of the end of 2019. And for the first part of 2019, I was actually also writing Disfigured, my nonfiction book, which is looking specifically at fairy tales and how villains in fairy tales are often portrayed in ways that we would now recognize as being people who are disabled. And so I, was reading this and thinking about this, and I had been struggling with The Centaur's Wife up to that point, trying to figure out how all of these things came together, this sort of dystopia, real world elements of the book, but then also these centaurs, they weren't quite meshing. It really was hard to make these two things come together. And then once I was reading about the fairy tales and thinking about the connections there, and thinking about how we tell stories as a way of moving through trauma, that's when it started to click for me. And in the summer of 2019 was when I wrote all the little fairy tales that are sort of peppered throughout The Centaur's Wife. And that was kind of the final thing that sort of cinched it all together for me. So it still feels kind of magical when I think back on it, to kind of, go through this journey of writing the book and then almost at the end of the journey, find that thing that really ties it all together.
Great. I often, we're talking about, I've been intrigued by that combination of the fable and the dystopic story. So often I feel like fairy tale or fable is brought in to adult works, at least in that sort of magic realist lens. I wondered if you could talk to us some more about bringing together fable with speculative fiction with this dystopia.
Mhm. Well, I think I've been interested in for a long time now in genre blending in literature, just in general. My first book, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, was a novel about a man who grew wings, or woke up one day with wings, and it was sort of a spiritual book, but also just this kind of sense of him dealing with this suddenly different body, and questioning whether there was something wrong with his mental health, and kind of dealing with all of these questions. So it was a magic, sort of a fabulous / magic realist
12 there tonight.
but
Perfect.
also
3.
Sorry
but
about
also that's okay. But also a book that just had sort of contemporary realism in it as well. So it was a mixture of both of those things. And I think it's because I kind of just want to write about what I want to write about. And I don't necessarily think that I have to always feel constrained by the particular conventions of a genre. And I think that's a movement in and of itself that is gaining more traction in the literary world now. You have writers like Silvia Moreno Garcia, who is doing a lot of work, in the Gothic side of literature, but also bringing elements of the Gothic into mystery and into contemporary literature and all these kinds of things. And there's a lot of books, Taya Lim's An Ocean of Minutes, which was shortlisted for the Giller in 2016, I think it was, has also that speculative fiction mixed with literary fiction element of things. And I think really I write because I just want my imagination to go a million different places. And working in the realm of speculative literature has been really freeing in that sense, because really I think at its core, any fiction is speculative in the sense that it is imagining a world that doesn't actually exist, or imagining characters who don't actually exist, even if that world is recognizably our world. And I just like the idea of embracing, the possibilities inherent in that genre, in that idea of you're creating a world, and anything that you want to happen can happen in this world, so long as you, the author, believe in it, right? And really carry it through. And part of growing into that and growing into my love of the genre has been recognizing the confidence that's necessary as a writer to be able to create these worlds and to carry them through, right? I mean, I couldn't have written a novel about centaurs that are, born from the union between a horse who happens to fall in love with a woman, if I hadn't actually really believed that happened for those characters, right? It was so fully fleshed out to me, that I was able to carry it all the way through. And I guess just the sense of working in the speculative realm and being able to have an imagination that has no constraints feels really exciting to me. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
Well, it leads us wonderfully into my next sort of question, which is, there's a fairly significant breaking point in the story where we go from a dystopic world, but one that's sort of recognizably a world that might be our own, to a more violent and a more complex one.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that, about the construction of that?
I think, I think that actually, in some ways, even though you're right, it does, it's a pivotal moment where you move from a sort of realistic-ish world into one that's much more magical in some ways. But to me, it's all kind of interconnected. Like the idea that at the beginning of the novel, the world is decimated by a meteor shower. And then in the wake of this destruction, a lot of humanity has perished, and people are trying to survive, and they're noticing things like the fact that in the absence of, you know, humanity's kind of ruling over the natural world kind of comes back in abundance, you know, like really, really starts to take over. So for me, there was a kind of inherent magic in the world right from the very beginning. It's just that it became louder and louder and louder as the novel went on. So it in some ways felt like a natural progression to me, even though, you know, when I got to that pivotal moment in the writing of the book, I hadn't actually anticipated that that was something that was going to happen. So it did come as a surprise to me, which is always exciting as a writer, because I always worry that if I, you know exactly what's going to happen in a story from beginning to end, it always feels like it runs the risk of being predictable. Like if I can tell what's going to happen, then my reader is going to know what's going to happen, right? So being able to write something that surprised me was quite invigorating, because I was hopeful that it would then surprise the reader, but then be something at the same time where, you know, a reader could go back and see, oh, okay, I see hints of this kind of stuff coming through. And that, of course, all came together in, you know, the wonderful magical process of revising. Like it didn't all happen all at once. Like thank goodness for, you know, wonderful editors who stick with writers all the way through millions of drafts, because they really, I mean, The Centaur's Wife wouldn't be the book that it is without the input and the magic of my editor, who you know, saw that sort of magical kernel of the book and saw how that could be carried through right from the beginning to the end, really early on in the process. So I'm very, very grateful. And you know, I'm working on a new project right now that has had some of those kind of similar surprises in the course of writing it, which always feels really exciting to me. And I'm grateful that I get to continue doing this kind of thing with writing and discovering stories. And I hope, as I always hope, that this, you know, this next project will also turn into a book. We'll see. It's still in the not even the revising stage. It's still in the first draft embryo stage. So it'll probably be a while before it gets anywhere solid, but you know, I'll get there eventually.
I'm intrigued by what you said about The Centaur's Wife starting as a kernel of a short story. Tell us more about the process of bringing it from a short story to the novel that we read.
Yeah. So I was, this was back in 2014, and I was thinking about that question of desire, like I had talked about a little earlier today. Thinking about what it means to desire something that you can't have. And because I have a strange mind, I was thinking, oh, well, that would be like, you know, someone being in love with a centaur, or being in love with some other kind of magical creature that you know, conceivably could never have a relationship with. So I wrote this short story about this woman who was in love with a centaur. And then because I had been reading dystopias and interested in dystopias, it sort of took place in this dystopian world. But it was very short. It was only about 2,500 words, and it was quite different from what the actual novel turned out to be. And I remember workshopping the story with a group of writer friends who at the time also lived in Hamilton. And one of my friends, the writer Liz Harmer, read it, and she said, you know, I think there's more here. Like I want to know more about these centaurs, these characters. I don't think there's enough here. There's so much more that can be said about them. So I went back to the story and I expanded it, and it grew from 2,500 words to then a novella, which was about 15,000 words. And I had a short story collection manuscript that we were, my agent and I were taking around to different publishing houses. And by that point, I had sort of started to think that maybe the novella, the 15,000 word Centaur short story, could be even larger. So I had started thinking about what it would look like if it was a novel. And what ended up happening was they took the short story out of the collection, and then we pitched to Random House with the short story collection, and then the novel as kind of they got a tidbit of the novel and then a sort of synopsis and a pitch for what the novel could be. And they said yes. And then they said, let's work on the novel first, because publishers really, really like to publish novels as opposed to short stories. So that was part of the reason for giving them the proposal too, was because I wanted to sweeten the deal, because I wasn't sure that they would just say yes to the collection on its own. And it worked. Hooray, hooray. So yeah, so that was 2016. And then the next 3 years was writing the novel, and then, rewriting and rewriting the novel, which was in and of itself an interesting experience, because usually what you do as a writer is you submit like a finished book to a publisher for consideration. You don't submit an idea, and then, much less have the publisher say, yes, let's publish it. And then you're sort of contractually obligated to finish it, which, is great. I was very, 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 and still am very grateful to Random House for the opportunity and for everything that they put into this book. But finishing a book when you're already under contract is a very different experience than handing a book that's finished to a publisher, and all you have to do is, work with them on edits and then get it out. And I'm still grateful for the experience. Either way, it was a really great learning opportunity, and I learned a lot about myself and my style, and then also about editing through the course of working on the book. So it was a lovely journey, and my first novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, actually came out of a short story as well. And the novel that I'm currently working on right now has done the same thing. So I think it just happens to be, I write because I really like the short story as a form. I think they're really innovative, and there's a lot that you can actually do. Funnily enough, there's a lot you can do in a short story that is sometimes difficult to do on the wider canvas of a novel. And so I just seem to do this. I seem to write short stories, and then the ones that stick around and that kind of whisper in the back and say, okay, we're not done yet. We want, a little more space, a little more. We want the stage to be a little bit bigger. That's where the novels come from. So it's worked for me so far. I'm not going to knock the process. if it ain't broke, don't fix it, as they say.
Absolutely. In lots of ways, what I read the story to be saying is that to be resilient is to find a way to be bound together with each other and with our natural world. Can you talk about some ways, if that's a thread through the book, and the ways in which you wove it and places in the book that we should look out for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started writing the book, it was again about trauma and working through trauma, but it didn't have as much of a disability focus. In the early drafts, the main character wasn't disabled. Some of the other characters in the novel were, but they weren't as much of a focus as they ended up being in the final version of the book. And as I was going through these drafts and, going through my own life and doing more work in disability activism, and then also writing and thinking about Disfigured and the narratives that I was looking at there, I recognized that The Centaur's Wife was very much about disability, and the disability narrative, both on a personal level for Heather, the main character who has cerebral palsy, much like myself, and then also for other characters in the book who, have disabilities of their own, but then are also interacting with other characters who are disabled. And one of the things that really interested me about how that ties into it being a dystopian narrative is that a lot of the dystopian books that were coming out 5 or 6 years ago had a very kind of similar approach to disability, where it's the kind of standard, like if the world, if the power goes out and there's no power anymore and traveling becomes really difficult, people who are dependent on machines or dependent on technology in some way to help them with their disabilities end up being the people who are left behind, because technology fails and no one knows what to do when technology isn't there to help them. So for example, Station 11, which I really, really love as a book, there's a character at the beginning of the novel, when everybody is sort of reacting to this pandemic, this character who's disabled, and he's in a high-rise apartment with his brother, and he tells his brother to go and find, salvation for himself, because he recognizes that he's just going to, quote unquote, weigh his brother down, just like be a hindrance to him getting to safety. And the impression, after the brother leaves, of course, is that his disabled brother eventually perishes. And I was really interested, even though I understand where that narrative comes from and how it, logistically, it works within a dystopian book, a dystopian narrative, because you don't have technology to save you in ways that, we have become accustomed to in the world in which we live. But I was interested in approaching that from another angle and thinking about, what happens in a book or in a scenario where the world as we know it has changed irrevocably, and technology isn't necessarily something that we have, but we have people who want to survive, and we have people who want other people to survive. How do you move forward in a space like that if you don't have technology to rely on? And the way that you move forward in a space like that is by coming together as a community, and by, Tasha is a doctor, one of the main characters in the book, and there's a girl in the book named Elise who has cystic fibrosis. And, with cystic fibrosis, she in many ways is dependent on technology to help her survive. But in the absence of technology and this new world in which they live, she becomes very much dependent on Tasha and Tasha's partner Annie as a kind of human counterpart to that technology, right? So they're the ones that sort of surround her. They help her doing things like cleaning out her lungs and medical procedures, which they can do because they're medical professionals, but also because they're people who care about her and people who want her to survive. And so I was interested in looking at how we as a community, the wider sort of question in the book is how we as a community can come together to help those who are most vulnerable among us, because it's not often, well, maybe often is the wrong word, but it's not always something that I have seen in narratives, right? So many books, particularly books about people who triumph over circumstances, are about people finding inner strength within themselves to overcome trials and challenges. And people in The Centaur's Wife also find that strength within themselves. But I think key to the axis of the novel is people finding that strength in other people as well, and finding that strength in one another, and deciding to go forward as a family. And I on a personal level, I finished the novel in sort of the latter part of 2019. And then my best friend passed away at the beginning of December of 2019. And I was suddenly on this grief journey that I hadn't anticipated, which looked eerily, in some ways, quite similar to the journey that Heather and Tasha and other characters in The Centaur's Wife undertake in the course of the book. And it was really, really interesting to me how certain things echoed through the book into my own life in terms of communities that I found through grief, and people and family, to be honest, that I found through grief, and chosen family that I wouldn't have had otherwise as a result of this, traumatic thing that had happened in my life. And it just really made me think differently about the way that we all move through the world. And then, another echo of that came with the pandemic and the subsequent year. After writing the book, before it actually came out into the world, having the pandemic come down in March of 2020, and then suddenly seeing how people did those same things, right? People found community in ways that they weren't necessarily anticipating, whether it was, through online virtual events or activities or Zoom hangouts or things like that. And your lives went away in a direction that you totally weren't foreseeing, and not necessarily a direction that you would have chosen either. But there was still room for growth, and still room for laughter, and still room for love in those spaces. And so I really wanted, I wanted the novel to end on a note of hope, because I think for me, it has been a real lesson in learning that, you can undergo some things that are really, really terrible, and really things that completely change who you are as a person, but there's still room to reach forward to other things. And there's a certain kind of magic in that I'm still hanging on to, because obviously, grief does not go away. It shifts and changes your world in the year after it happens, in this, the second year after it happens, all throughout the rest of your life. And I think we're seeing echoes of that too with the pandemic, right? The world has changed irrevocably for so many people. And, we're sort of getting back in some ways to some semblance of normal, but so many things are still different. And there's an ongoing sense of grief there for many people. And the way that we deal with that is by finding community in different places. So I hope that the book can contribute to that conversation in some way. And that, to go back to one of our earlier topics of discussion, I think that's where another thing that's magical about working with fairy tales and folk tales is that because they're not necessarily rooted in something that is recognizably our world, they have the potential to apply to a very wide range of different things, right? Many people can see themselves in the story of, the tortoise and the hare, for example, right? That can apply to a whole bunch of very different situations. And I think there's just something really lovely about that, about the way that, we have used storytelling in this kind of community-focused way, at the same time as we also use storytelling as a very sort of individualistic way, right? To teach ourselves individual lessons. It's just magic from beginning to end, really, is what it comes down to, both as a writer and a reader, I think.
Wonderful. Certainly one of the key places where that thread of resilience lies is in Heather's journey. Can you tell us more? One of the key things for many of us lied in Heather's understanding of her relationship with her father and Heather's understanding of her disability. Can you tell us more about those and how they react with each other?
Yeah. So in case anyone hasn't read the book, Heather, like I said, has cerebral palsy like myself. And so she has quite a visible limp and deals with, other issues around that, like chronic fatigue and that sort of thing. And as a child, she has a mother who is, very sort of hesitant and just cautious where Heather is concerned, wants her to be safe, wants her, to make sure that she's not overstretching herself. And then she has a father who, at least at the outset, seems like he's very much, he really believes in Heather and what she can do, and that she can overcome anything if she puts her mind to it, kind of deal. And then sort of about a quarter of the way through the book, we find out that Heather's father has previously died, and he dies in the act of taking Heather up this sort of mountain that overlooks her childhood home. And when they get to the top of the mountain, they encounter the centaurs that live on the mountain. And Heather is sort of, horrified to discover that her father has essentially brought her up the mountain, not because, as she thought, he thinks that she's strong and that she can do it, and that he wanted to show her she could do it. He's brought her up because he knows that there's some sort of magic about the mountain, and he wants that magic to heal her, to make it so that she doesn't limp anymore, so that she's not, she doesn't have CP anymore. And, it's something that really crushes her, because he sees her as, having this body where she moves about in a great deal of pain, and it sort of keeps her away from doing things that she would really like to do. And Heather, as a child, just sees, this is her body, this is her life, this is all that she's ever known. And as a child, recognizing that her father doesn't see that and has never seen that is a huge betrayal for her. And after his death, she really spends a long time sort of mired in the guilt and the betrayal around that, and really having to work through her own sort of feelings and attachment issues that inevitably come up as a result of that, right? Because if someone that you love, if you discover that someone that you love has seen you a certain way as a result of your disability for so long, it really, plays on your sense of trust. It certainly played on Heather's sense of trust, and it leads to problems with her believing that people can love her or can see her as someone of value and someone of importance in their lives. And it definitely plays out in her relationship with her husband Brendan, and her sense of or lack of trust where that's concerned. And that, was also something that was interesting to me as someone who, I haven't had Heather's particular, I want to say hang up, but it's not really the right phrase, but her approach to her disability is not my own approach to my disability. We obviously have had different lives where disability is concerned. But that sense of like assuming that people see you in a particular way because of how you walk or because of how you move is something that is very familiar to me. And I really wanted to explore what it meant from the perspective of a character in fiction, a main character in fiction, to be honest, because there's not a lot of characters. Like when I was growing up, I never read books about main characters who had cerebral palsy like myself. There are more now, definitely. But I was interested in writing about an adult who had cerebral palsy like myself, and cerebral palsy shaped her in such a way that it made it a central force of the book. But the book itself is also not just about her disability, which is not to say that if it had been solely about her disability, that would have had value, absolutely. But I was also interested in exploring how disability is just one element, one part of what makes someone who they are. And, she is made by her disability, but she's also made by the choices that she continues to make, right? By the things that she chooses not to see, or the narrative that she chooses to tell herself about her disability and how she feels like, she's not worthy of love and those kinds of things. It's never cut and dried, right? We are always complicated and difficult as human beings. We're always flawed. And it was interesting to me to really, really dig deep into those parts of Heather as a character, because I love her, but she's very prickly, right? And she's very rude in many ways. She's very standoffish. She doesn't have a lot of friends in the city that she's grown up in. And sometimes that's because people have treated her badly, but some of it is also because she has herself, put up walls, very, very thick walls. And how do you explore that as a writer? How do you take that richness of what it means to be human and to be alive and to be flawed in the ways that we are all human and alive and flawed, and put it into a story, and then add, centaurs and murderous plants and all that sort of stuff in there as well, because why not?
On a related note, and we've talked about it already, but we're gonna try to go for the 2-for-1 and have you here talking about Centaur's wife, but hear more about Disfigured. Is there anything that you haven't covered yet that you'd like to share with us about disability and fairy tales, and about how your own disability impacts your writing?
I mean, disability and fairy tales, I think it's in and of itself such a rich thing. One of the things that I try to do when I talk about disability awareness and accessibility awareness is, the reality of the matter is that when we push for advocacy around disability, what we're ultimately pushing for is a world in which everyone recognizes that we all have needs, that disabled people, do not have needs that are special or, more worthy of attention than the needs of anyone else. We all have needs that are equal, and we all equally deserve to have those needs be met. So, in addition to my limp, I also wear eyeglasses and have, quite a strong prescription. And my need to have that worked out for me, my need for glasses is equally important to my functioning in society, and being able to be an equal part of the world, right? So that's important in the same way that someone who has mobility challenges is equally entitled to a wheelchair or a walker or other mobility aid to help them through life. And nobody should be encountering barriers to acquiring these kinds of things, because it just puts them at the same level as everyone else of moving through and participating in society. And one of the things that I want people to think about when they, whether they hear about Disfigured or maybe happen to read it, is how we for so long have really maligned disability as this marker of difference that cannot be mitigated or cannot be changed. And it's really easy to see that in fairy tales, because the disabled people are almost always the villains, right? They sort of look different, they move different, they act differently. They're, Rumpelstiltskin is a dwarf who also has a bad personality and is quite evil in some ways. And the story about him is not a redemptive story. He's just kind of this bad person who gets his just desserts in the end, in some way. And we have played that narrative in Rumpelstiltskin, but then in also fairy tales, in Snow White and Seven Dwarfs with the evil queen, and then in Hansel and Gretel with the witch with the crutch, and the figure of the witch in the fairy tales, and the figure of the evil king who has a facial difference, or the ugly hunchback dwarf. All of these kinds of tropes play out in fairy tales, usually in the same way, where there's someone who's evil or someone who has to be taught a lesson. And I just really want people to start thinking differently about the kinds of stories that we tell, and what it means when someone who physically looks different or physically moves differently is portrayed in a negative way on screen. Because if you are someone who, for example, doesn't have a facial difference, you don't necessarily think twice of watching James Bond films and seeing, a villain who has a scar across their face or some other kind of, facial disfigurement. But someone who has a facial difference, when they only ever see themselves as a villain in a story, it has a huge impact on how they go about their lives. And, seeing people who limp, and people with mobility difficulties portrayed in sort of time-worn ways in the stories that we tell and the films that we watch, has definitely had an impact on me, right? It had an impact on me as a child, because my fellow peers, we're just quite happy to single out someone who looked different because they didn't want to be the person who looked different, right? Or who was made fun of. And my disability has shaped my life in that very particular way. And it's, something that I've come to terms with, and something that in many ways has turned out to be a gift, because I feel like I have a certain amount of insight, as do many disabled people have certain amounts of insight into what it means to be someone who is vulnerable in that way, and how we can better build society to care for those vulnerable people in much the same way that we can tell stories that, you know, center around those who are vulnerable, and how do we build worlds and build communities that put those vulnerable people at the center of things so that they're not vulnerable anymore, is really essentially what it comes down to. And to sort of tie it all in together, the fairy tales that I'm working on now are sort of looking at, you know, dealing in that same sort of magical realm, dealing in that world of speculation, speculative literature, where anything can happen. But then also, you know, anything can happen, and also let's tell it differently. So, you know, anything can happen in the story. You know, a girl can fall asleep in a tower and sleep for 100 years, and then a prince can come and rescue her from a fire-breathing dragon. Okay, yes, that is, you know, unbelievable in some ways and magical and wonderful, but it's also a magical story that we've heard before. So how do we tell magical stories that end differently or reach for different things? There's comfort in the fairy tales that we know and love, absolutely. But, you know, there can be a different kind of comfort in the fairy tales that are new to us, and the fairy tales that explore different things. And that's just really, I think, what I was, you know, one of the many things that I was trying to get at in Disfigured was helping people to think about what it means to tell stories differently, and what it means to envision new possibilities for how, what makes, you know, a happy life in the world. Because stories teach us so much about that, right? What it means to be happy and to be fulfilled, and just turning that lens on things that we maybe haven't considered before. Yeah, it's just something that really, really fascinates me as a writer, as a reader, as a disabled person myself. And it probably is something that will be a theme that carries through my work, probably for my whole life. Maybe not the fairy tales all the time, but that question of, you know, difference and what it means to move through the world in a different way, and from there to build the world in a different way. It's probably always something that I'll write about in one way or another.
You keep on making my segues for me, because my next question is to have you tell us about your work with Fold, and the importance of that, and what you'd like us to know about the Festival of Literary Diversity.
Yeah, thank you. So the Fold is started as a literary festival in Brampton that ran in May of every year. And now we have expanded. So we're a charitable organization, the Fold Foundation, and we run 2 festivals every year. So we have the May Festival, the Festival of Literary Diversity, which is primarily for adults and young adults. So adult literature, and then young adult, sort of mid-high school to senior high school age books. And then in the fall, we have our Fold Kids Book Fest, which is literature that focuses on picture books and goes up to young adults. So the age range is about 0 to 16, 17. And then we also have various other programming initiatives that run throughout the year. And the whole point of the Fold really is to highlight stories from marginalized storytellers. So people who, you know, come from a wide variety of different groups, BIPOC writers and illustrators, writers from the LGBTQ community, disabled writers, and then also, you know, writers who come from other elements of marginalization. So looking at differences in class, for example, differences in gender, differences in ethnicity and ability, and all kinds of other things. Basically just looking at the ways in which even the literary world that we have known and loved for so long, you know, has had barriers in place to certain people who want to tell stories. And what does it mean when those barriers are taken away, when those previously marginalized storytellers, you know, have the opportunity to really, really tell their stories and shine. And working with the Fold, I started working with them in 2016. So I've been with the organization for 5 years now. And working with the fold has been key really to developing my own confidence as a disabled writer and recognizing where, my intersections of privilege, and then also marginalization have allowed me the space to talk about these issues, but then also to make space at the same time. And it's something that I'm really, really grateful for. Last year was our first virtual festival as a result of the pandemic. So we have, if anyone is unfamiliar with us, if you go to our website at thefoldcanada.org, we do have videos of previous festival sessions in 2020. So there's a lot of really great conversations between writers on our website that you can go and see. We do have our next Children's Festival coming up this fall. That will also be virtual. And yeah, we hope to, continue doing this work year on year and hopefully growing and expanding and doing different kinds of things throughout the country and in different ways. We've incorporated digital programming into our festival on a permanent basis now. So even when that magical day arrives at some point in the future and we go back to in-person programming, we'll still have digital programming. So people from all across the country, all across the world will be able to access fold content, even if you can't actually physically make it to Brampton. And we do have something for everyone. And I really recommend that people check us out because we love stories and storytelling at the end of the day. And we just want to give people more avenues for getting their stories out into the world.
Thank you. So now we have a little bit of time for questions, and one's already come in on the chat. So Kimberly asks, could you chat a bit about the mountain as the setting, as part of the setting, and almost as a character? It's portrayed as a magical, powerful entity, and often as something to be feared. And also the fact that it's a haven for the centaurs and a danger for the humans.
Mm-hmm. So the mountain, thank you for saying that. The mountain is one of my favorite characters in the book. And, the mountain just kind of naturally was a character right from the very beginning. I think because I had started writing this origin story about the centaurs, and I sort of knew that they lived on this mountain. And I was picturing, you think of a mountain, you think of Mount Everest, like these tall crags, very sort of rocky and gnarled. And I just sort of automatically saw it as like a really grizzled, very fierce grandparent / parent who, was very jealous, I guess it really is the right word, but also very protective of the ones that it loved. And I was interested in the ways that strength plays out in different capacities, and resiliency plays out in different capacities, right? We look at stone and we think about the weathered face of stone and how stone endures through things like storms and centuries and all those kinds of things. But for example, if there was a meteor shower and, a meteor came and smashed into the side of a mountain, it's going to maybe not obliterate the mountain entirely, but it's going to cause a great deal of damage, right? And that damage will always be there. That scar will always show. Whereas if a meteor crashes into the ground, the crater will be there, yes, but eventually you will have things like plants and trees and lichen and moss and all those kinds of things, grasses that grow over the crater and, make it into something different. So these plants, which are sort of, when contrasted against a mountain, are very sort of soft and seem kind of ephemeral, and that they're, they maybe don't last as long. But on the grand scheme of things, they do. And so I was interested in that tension, and it just kind of grew from there, this sense of this jealous mountain. And then also, the grasses and the sort of the lower flatlands and grasses and lands that were sort of pulling the centaur, or the horse rather, at the beginning of the novel, the horse who falls in love with a woman. He's essentially pulled away by change, right? And by the sense that something can be different from the world in which he currently lives. And the mountain doesn't want anything to change. The mountain wants everything to stay exactly the way that it was. And what happens when that is no longer possible? What happens when change is inevitable? How do we adapt? Some of us, like the trees and the flowers and the plants around us, grow and take over the world in many possible ways in the novel. And then some of us, like the mountain, are sort of hurt irrevocably, and can't grow beyond that moment of pain. And again, because I have a weird mind, and a weird way of approaching these things, it just seemed natural to have that come out through this sort of tete-a-tete between a mountain and trees. And I guess that's what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about having the sort of sense of seeing your story through. It's just getting to a point where you just, okay, there's this mountain, and it's kind of like a character in the book. I mean, it is a character in the book, and there are these trees that are also like murderous plants, and that's just what's going to happen. And it's very weird, but readers will stick with me, I hope. And if they don't stick with me, that's also okay, right? Because every book is not for every person. And I think that's one of the things that I've become more comfortable with. And I have the mountain really honestly to thank for it, because I wrote towards something that I knew was unusual and strange, but I just kind of had a sense of the rightness of it. And that weirdness and strangeness is something that has resonated with a lot of people. It also hasn't resonated with others, but that's okay. There are other books out there for them, just not mine.
Love it. So if anybody else wants to unmute and ask a question themselves, or put a question in the chat, we can ask Amanda a few more questions, I'm sure. Anybody?
Hi, it's Katie. My toddler has refused to go to sleep, so he's sitting on my lap and may interrupt us at some point while I'm talking. But I did have a question. Well, actually, you answered a lot of my questions, Amanda, while you were talking, so thank you. And good questions, Faith, on your side as well. So I think in my list of questions that I prepared, I only had one left unanswered, and that was there one of the fables, Amanda, that you were more drawn to, or is sort of like your favorite?
Mm-hmm. I really liked the Goose Girl, the sort of retelling, reimagining of the Goose Girl. Because that was another one of the moments in the book that surprised me in the course of writing it. Like I sort of had an inkling as the story was going along that it was kind of about the haves versus the have-nots, and how that tension plays out between the two of them. But then, at the end of the story, when the queen slits the throat of the goose, I had not seen that coming. So that was another moment in writing the book that I was like, oh, okay, all right, well, it's good to still be surprised yourself as the writer. And I also really liked, and I'm forgetting that, I think it was the River Sprite, the one about the mother who had twins, and was really grappling with how difficult it was. I really liked that one too, because I was trying to think about the world shaking thing that is having kids, and how you balance the world that you knew before and the life that you had before with the new life that you have now. And I was also finishing up Disfigured while I was writing that particular tale, and thinking about the aspect of the changeling and how that has played out in Irish and Scottish mythologies, and how a lot of contemporary accounts of changelings now do look at it in terms of disability. And that was just something that really, really fascinated me. And I felt like it needed to be in there, both from the sort of this perspective of a child that maybe was a changeling, but then also, a mother who was maybe dealing with, a mother or a parent who was dealing with difficulty around having a new child, and feeling like they weren't bonding with that child, and how to approach that in a way that was compassionate and also vital, in a way that really just looked at it in a different way. Yeah, so I think that would be those two would be the ones that would be my favorite.
Thank you. Yeah, the Goose Girl one was my favorite. That was the one that oh, sorry, Cam, the one that stuck with me. And I keep on thinking about it over and over again, even after, like, months after I've read the book. And yeah, and then I was watching a TV series recently. Sorry, he's coloring in the background. The White Lotus, and I don't know if anyone else has watched that.
Just
And
last weekend.
oh, okay, yeah, and I was watching it thinking, this is really similar to it's got that same that same vibe of the queen who's like, oh, how entertaining, my sweet little geese, and then beheads them at the table when they've sort of overstepped their bounds. And yeah, so that have and have nots, I was thinking about the Goose Girl when I was watching that show.
Thank you so much for saying that. That is just like, oh, I loved The White Lotus. So what a gift. Thank you.
Well, thank you for writing it.
You're so welcome.
Any other questions for Amanda? Feel free to unmute or put them in the chat. I think that might be all. Amanda, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's a stunning book. Whenever any of us read it, we all ran into work the next day saying, I really need to talk to all of you about this book. And thanks for your time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Faith, for your wonderful questions. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for your wonderful questions as well, and for listening so attentively. It really was such a pleasure to share this space with you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and so grateful that it was chosen as part of the program. So thank you all so much for that.
Of course, stay tuned. We anticipate that the Simcoe Reads debate will air October 3rd. Once Rogers gets over having to air all of the election news, and you'll have a little more than a week to vote for your favorite book for Simcoe Reads. So thank you all very much for coming, and thanks again to you, Amanda.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the night.